Well, welcome to this edition of Talk About Black. I have three fabulous guests who have joined me this morning to talk about the whole business of being black in 2018. And let me just ask them to introduce themselves. So first of all, we have Cage Boons. Then we also have Rashida Abdulai. And we have Dave McQueen. Thank you guys so much for coming on the show. Why don't we just start, Cage, with you. Tell us a little bit about who you are and a bit about your story.
My name is Cage Boons. I study philosophy at the University of Hertfordshire. I'm 21 years old, and a bit about my story. So I'm from Liberia, but I'm a Dutch national. My parents fled during the Civil War. So that experience has kind of shaped a lot of my adolescence, and two people sticking together and being robbed of an education, and now coming to Europe and facing sort of systemic racism and trying to provide for their child at the same time has been difficult. So my upbringing's been not the easiest, but I'm very blessed to be where I am. And I've done very well, but I've had to really fight to be where I am. But I'm very pleased that I've been given the various opportunities that I have.
Tell us a little bit about your parents' journey. I mean, that sounds like an extraordinary
of course.
Thing that they went through.
Yeah. So there's again in Liberia there's a military coup, and because of that military coup the government was sort of usurped, and because of that the native tribe, which was the Kram people, so we had an indigenous leader, and he was basically, everyone from that tribe where he was from was basically prosecuted, so everyone there had to flee. So again they fled, they stayed in the Netherlands, were given nationality, and we've come to England, and they've kind of been building their life from scratch. My dad was in his first year at university actually in Liberia, and that was completely, his university was destroyed. And so yeah, it's been very tough for them, having to work menial jobs and not being able to necessarily pursue their dreams. That must be incredibly tough. I've been able to go to university, pursue my academic and professional goals, but that was robbed away from them. They had to just kind of survive. And with that, it's been very tough for them, but they've kind of lived vicariously through me, in a sense, so that's why I'm so sort of persistent to be excellent, and really kind of, I want to get my degree for them in a way. Yeah. Well,
we'll hear a little bit more about your story as we go through. But Rashida, welcome to you. You're a successful corporate lawyer at a major law firm. You stepped away last year, I think, and you set up your own company. Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Well, it was just earlier this year, so not very long ago at all. But yes, I grew up in London to a Bajan mother and a Sierra Leonean brother.
Woo!
And had a great childhood, I have to say. But it wasn't without its challenges. I grew up in a town near Heathrow Airport, naming no names, where it was common for us to have National Front rallies on the high street.
Do you remember that? You remember?
I remember them. I remember graffiti, on the walls coming home from school with horrible words, people saying things, kids trying to pick fights with me and my brothers and sisters, spitting on our bikes, all sorts of real horridness. But I have to say, it was the way I looked at it, I think coming from such a loving household, was that I actually pitied them. I felt sorry for them. I felt that, if they came from a home where, they were being looked after, they wouldn't be on the street all times of night with ragged, dirty clothes and, being young. The things that I picked up perhaps weren't the most important things, but I would notice things like the fact that their teeth were so terrible, and their hair was disheveled, their clothes, and I just thought, oh gosh, poor guys. But I, grew up in a really big family. There was a lot of love in the house. I didn't have any lawyers in the family, but I knew that was something I wanted to do. My mother was a foster carer as well, and so I grew up with a lot of young people who were from an even worse background in terms of what they'd gone through and the things that they had to see at such a young age. So I knew I was lucky, and it made all of us have this attitude of, we're actually doing well, we're okay, we've got nothing to be downbeaten about, we're lucky.
But we're going to ask you some more questions about how you made it through that tricky process of coming into law and then ending up doing what you so successfully did. But Dave, tell us a little bit about your journey and about the company that you run, Legacy 71. We'd love to hear a bit about that.
Okay, so I want my fist bump as well because I'm half Bajan. Okay, my mum's from Barbados.
Connections.
My dad's from Grenada, so they are Caribbean expats who came here to plug the workforce.
So this is Windrush.
Just slightly after. Just slightly after. I call them expats instead of immigrants. I think it's very important to be able to note that because they had British passports. They came here in their 20s. I'm one of three. I'm the middle of three. The best looking of all three of them as well. I also name that. I grew up in Harlesden in North West London for 10 years, and then I moved to Harrow, Sudbury Hill in Harrow, and spent the majority of my formative years there as well. Again, I was very fortunate. My parents were very driven around us getting really good education because they felt education was the way for us to be able to succeed. I was always very outspoken. Nothing has changed. But my dad always encouraged me to make sure that I balance it, make sure that I know exactly what I'm talking about. Don't just talk for the sake of it, make sure you know, and always have the evidence to back up stuff that you're going to have. And so my career, my first career, I started out in accounts. I used to do raves, and I used to make a lot of money, and I wasn't paying any tax, and I didn't want to go to prison. So I started to go into finance to understand how I could manage this better. I stayed in finance for a while, went into technology afterwards because I was really fascinated about how the way that technology can make our lives easier and more a lot more processed. And then in my early 30s, I realized I couldn't work for anybody else because I just caused too much trouble. And I went and I started my own businesses. And what's brought me to this point now about Legacy 71, which is the company you mentioned, one of my two companies, is I've created an incubator which specifically focuses on tech founders of Pan-African descent who can build companies. Primarily at the moment, I'm focusing on financial technology, health technology and education technology, and I believe there is a way of being able to both create wealth for the economy as a whole, but also to get a lot of individuals from similar backgrounds as myself to recognize that companies and changes can be made in that difference, where in so many instances we are underrepresented. And that is the essence of Legacy 71. And I'll tell you the name. Do you want to say the name now or later? You tell me later. You want it now or later?
Now, tell us now. Tell us now.
So Legacy is that a lot of stuff that happens in technology, a lot of people go, they just want to be able to create big businesses, probably sell out to the biggest buyer, make a bit of money, and then move on to the next. But for me, I believe that if you're going to create wealth, you need to make it intergenerational. And so Legacy is about being able to create those companies that, in essence, you can be like a Jeff Bezos or a Mark Zuckerberg or an Elon Musk, where you're going to still be there many years later and you can pass that wealth on to another generation. The second bit about 71 is that I'm into numbers, and in numerology business, 71 is continuity. In Judaism, it's the number of wisdom. In Christianity, it's the number of the Holy Spirit. So I was able to touch so many different bases there. And plus, I started it this year, and I didn't even realize it until afterwards, but my dad turned 71 this year.
Look at that.
So it's a real significant thing. A Legacy 71 is a way of saying, I want to start something that will belong homage to my dad, as well as to the community.
So these are powerful, uplifting examples of what can be achieved. But let me just read you this. The family of a 16-year-old boy murdered in London's 5th killing in 6 days paid tribute to him today as another stabbed teenager fought for his life in hospital. The latest victim, age 17, was found just after 8 p.m. last night following a clash in an alley in West Hampstead. He had emergency surgery and his condition is described as critical. It came less than 24 hours after the 16-year-old, named locally as John, was stabbed in Tulse Hill in front of his distraught parents. A relative said he was retaking his GCSEs and was planning to go into engineering. He wanted to do an apprenticeship course. How do we stop this happening?
Wow. Firstly, obviously, it's a very sensitive point, and my sort of sympathies with the family. In terms of stopping this, we really need to engage the youth. Being a black boy, I feel like we're one of the most vulnerable groups currently. We have sort of societal factors pushing and pulling at us. We have negative stereotypes sort of imposed upon us. So it's so tough. It's a complex problem, and I feel measures such as stop and search should definitely be instituted, and the penalties, if found with a blatant article, should be sort of increased. So a 6-month period in jail wouldn't be sufficient. We need to make those penalties a lot tougher.
You're a supporter of stop and search in principle?
Definitely. I'm definitely supportive of stop and search.
Young black guy, the idea of being outside and being stopped and searched,
of course.
that you're okay with that?
And it's about building more positive relationship with positive relationships with police officers. If a police officer wants to stop me, we have an engagement, wants to search me, that's fine, because I know I don't have anything on me.
But maybe
as long as I'm compliant.
maybe it's less about the principle of it and the way it's applied. I mean, is that something that, Rashida, you have a view on?
It's something that does concern me. I think you've reached a level of maturity now where you understand, why the police are doing it. And perhaps, you can see the positives behind the motive.
Of course.
I agree. I've got nothing in principle against stop and search. I just think, unfortunately, it's not applied in a way that is helpful to the situation. I know of instances, in fact, with one of my cousins who, at a very young age, was stopped by the police.
How young?
We're talking, he was 11. And he's tall for his age, but that's not uncommon in our community. And the thought that at such a young age, he's being treated as an adult, he's being expected, to understand the things that, that you perhaps know now at a point in his life where his brain's not even fully developed. And he, thankfully, we're able to get through to him and explain what was going on.
So then, how do we deal with this? I mean, Dave, you work with in the community. Do you have some thoughts? I mean, stop and search is clearly just one. Yeah. It's almost at the end of the line, if you like. What that might get applied, but. Any thoughts around how we get into this community?
For me, first and foremost, it's a public health issue. I think too often it is being characterised as just a legal one, and in many instances, I think the narrative has been a bit twisted in that they focused it on gangs as well. But if you look at youth violence across the whole UK, what you will find is that yes, it's because black people are a minority, it will be very much amplified when you see these deaths and injuries specifically in London. But I can tell you, they have the same issues in Belfast and Edinburgh and Durham and Nottingham and across the country, and a lot of those demographics aren't primarily just black. So I think looking at youth violence across the board and thinking about things like poverty and how do we work with the police when, to be fair, a lot of trust has been lost. The McPherson report identified many years ago that there was institutionalized racism within the police force. I know a number of black and white people who still work in the police force who say that it still exists. So when we're talking about, and I take the point that Cage was saying about stop and search, but there's always going to be a mismatch if there's a lack of trust. And there are so many different points around that. A lot of young people carry knives to feel safe. Not that they feel that they're going to go and attack anybody, but because they feel that if they have this is the only way that they can survive. Not knowing that if you carry a knife with you, the chances of you getting stabbed or injured actually increases. So it's a constant dialogue. I think the last time we had this amount of fatalities around...
It's 119 this year, right?
The last time we had it was 2008. That's when it was at a last peak, so it's 10 years. So you're talking about a massive shift in the way it's been going down for years, and then all of a sudden it's come back up again. And it's so complex. It really is complex. There's no real easy, simple way around it, but I do believe there needs to be a lot of joined up thinking about it, and not just the sensationalizing in media.
So just give us an insight into what it's like to be a young black guy today on the streets of London. Let's take London, but I mean, where, can you give us some sort of sense of, you come out of your house in the morning, or, what is it like to be a young black kid in London today?
I'm going to hand that over to Cage because he's going to know better than me. So I'm further down the line, so I'm going to hand it over to Cage.
So I'm not from London, so I couldn't, I don't want to misrepresent any person's unique experience to London, but I'm from Northampton natively, so in terms of being a young black boy in Northampton, I'm from the area, so I've obviously built relationships with people. So the situation is a lot different. It's more of a rural, not say rural area, but we haven't got the same problems, or it's not as amplified as it is in London. So I don't want to mischaracterize a young black person's experience in London, but definitely just the typical of seeing my physicality and feeling threatened.
Does that happen, do you think? Do you think that
Yeah,
happens?
of course. And I generally try to neutralize that by being generally nicer than I would generally be in a normal situation, just to make people feel comfortable around me. So there is that
What does
sort
that look
of
like,
natural
being nicer
prejudice.
than you would generally be? You seem like a nice guy, Cage. That's generally, but...
Extra smile, or like David was saying, another good morning, saying good morning to everybody. So they just feel comfortable around me, but definitely that's an experience. Just people always feeling threatened.
Do you think people feel threatened by you're 6'2", big guy?
Yeah, definitely. And that's
Really?
the imagery that they see. It's usually sort of associated with violence or aggression, and even being confident, you're kind of generally characterized as someone who is arrogant. So it's tough. So you have to, I'm either docile or I'm myself. So to succeed, I feel like I have to be slightly docile.
Rashida, you're nodding. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, it's something that I've seen in the city as well, where, you know, I see young black men in particular trying to make it and having to deal with all of these misconceptions about who they are and the way that they come across to people, just bizarrely varying from being called overbearing and overconfident to not confident enough and not articulate enough. And unfortunately, it's because of the perceptions that people have when they see them. You know, if you're working for a very small statured white lady, then I have seen occasions where that individual felt that the young black junior on her team was overconfident. And
It's ridiculous.
that same individual had been told by many of the males in his team that he needed to be more confident and speak up a bit more. And so it's a very confusing message for that young man.
Yeah, of course.
How do they navigate that? And at the end of the day, when it comes to progression, it's the comments from the lady that he works for that matters. So I have seen a lot of young black men, unfortunately, having to navigate that really difficult path of not being able to be themselves and having to be aware of the impressions that others have of them and trying to almost counterbalance that by changing who they are.
Yeah.
And sorry to interrupt, I just wanted to say that's something that I'm incredibly anxious about going into the corporate workplace, understanding that can I actually be myself, because I tend to be quite jovial, rambunctious, and someone who just likes to engage, and that's part of my strength, someone who can build trust and be a personable person. So understanding that I can't be myself and I need to sort of assimilate to a corporate culture that may not even accept me for who I am.
Don't ever.
Yeah,
So I'm incredibly anxious. So
yeah, there is an anxiety about it. If I can just quickly flip back, there is in London there are a lot of younger black guys, across the board actually, a lot of younger black guys are excluded from schools in proportion to the other young males in the country. Young black males from year 9, so we're talking about 14, across the board are excluded from a number of schools, specifically in London. What that means is that we've got a lot of 14 and 15-year-olds walking around London who aren't either in traditional or mainstream schooling, and often there isn't a lot of guidance around it. Now, there are issues around that where a lot of teachers don't know how to deal with a tall black guy in a school who might be outspoken, but then that's perceived as rude, or who might go to challenge and then there is an issue around how they are treated, and then they look at other students in the school who will have been kept in or put in isolation where they may have been permanently excluded. There's enough data to back that up, that there's a lot of kids, young black boys, when they're excluded from school from year 9, there is an anticipation or there is data to support that by the time they get to 17 or 18, they're going to end up in the custodial system. So there's a lot of challenging around that. And as a young black man, yes, you have got things like social media where they exacerbate some forms of masculinity, which we don't actually apply to. There's issues of class as well. So for many, there is a confusion.
So this class point is interesting because class we tend to think of as a white phenomenon. Does this apply in our community?
Definitely, across the board. Definitely, there is. Although it's not spoken as much, I'm going to say I'm going to speak from a position of privilege where a lot of when I've worked in a lot of schools, there have been kids who say to me, "You speak so posh." I'm like, "I'm from Harrow, mate." Well, I say Harlesden first, and then I go to Harrow. And they say, "You speak so posh," and for me, that's not the case. But they will perceive that as posh. They will perceive that as, okay, so you live in your house, you're running your business, it's all right for you. And they will perceive that as a different class. And sometimes it's having to bridge that gap and say, look, I understand where you're coming from because this is part of my background. But for a lot of kids who don't see how they can cross that chasm, yeah, the class is a big issue.
I'm fascinated by your point about exclusion at age 14, and then you follow this well-worn path, I guess, to when you're 17, it's just inevitable. You end up in the system in some way, and suddenly, bang, you're one of the 10,000 black people in our prisons. There's this sense that if there was an intervention around that age of 12 to 14, you can put people on a different path, that they don't have to be going down this route. Is that something that you see?
I was having a conversation with Akala, so the rapper and educator Akala, and we were having a conversation about this earlier this year. And one of the things we were saying, imagine if there was a provision for a number of young black men who may be on the cusp of being able to be exposed to certain kinds of education and people that will move them away from that. But for me, it's not just something that will be done within the black community. It's got to be an integrated thing across the board, because teachers have to know how to deal with students like this. Again, as you said, your cousin being stopped at at age 11. Where does an 11-year-old who gets stopped and searched have the emotional intelligence or capacity to be able to speak to that adult and say, look, I understand what you were doing, officer, but in some ways this is quite traumatic for me. How do you actually deal with that individual who no longer wants to trust the police? And what are all those different agencies or people or parts of the community that make sure that doesn't happen? And there is no easy solution. And I actually believe that, although some people criticised Sadiq Khan the other day, I do believe in that it's going to be a generational shift. It's not going to happen overnight. It's got to happen in partnership.
I agree, but I have a son and
Yes.
another on the way,
Yeah.
and so I absolutely have to get this right for them.
Yeah.
I'm not in, I understand that it is a bigger problem. It can't change overnight.
Yeah.
But I'm quite an optimistic person by nature, and I think there's a lot that can be done.
Okay.
To give us
I
help give us
agree.
a sense of what that might look like.
I agree. It starts at home, I think, and it's about giving these young black men an idea of their sense of self-worth, who they are, what they can become, giving them the belief that actually they can achieve much more than they might think is possible, and really supporting and pushing that and keeping that consistent message going. I think I had that when I was young, and that's what made the difference for me. We didn't come from a middle class family at all. We didn't have people in the professions in our family, but from a very young age I was told, Rashida, you're brilliant. Whatever you put your mind to, you can achieve. And I believed it. And then I started to play that out. And then I started to see other people responding to me in a positive way at school, in the community generally. And that is what I think has led me to where I am today.
You see, it's amazing.
So those messages
are so important.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Sorry, Cage. I agree, but I do believe that those messages work really well in an individual capacity at the moment. For me, the generational shift is when it becomes more community and more global.
Yeah.
So, for example, I remember working in a school in South London last year, and this guy is absolutely bright. I told him he needs to go and get Mensa tested because he was so brilliant. But because of that brilliance, he was bored and he was restless. He didn't know how to navigate school. He didn't have the strongest relationship with his mother and father. And there were times where in a class, I would cuss him out. I said, I don't care who you are, I will cuss you out and I will tell you right here and now. He goes, no one talks to me like that. I go, I do, right here and now. In that room, when I had him for 2 hours, that guy was as humble as pie. He would know exactly what the boundaries are. But then I realized, halfway through the program, and this was a leadership program, he got suspended from school for carrying a knife. And what I realized was that in the 2 or so hours that we were in that room where those constant messages were coming, I'm telling the teachers that was good. But once he left the school, he didn't have that family environment. He didn't have that community that really said to him, you're excellent, you're brilliant, this is what we're going to do. He had stuff that was almost like pulling away all the energy. And my frustration is, I guess, and I'm a pragmatist more than an optimist, I apologize for this, okay? Because sometimes I'm looking at it in the practical way, is that I totally agree with what you're saying. There's so much stuff that we can do within individual stuff, within our families individually, but I believe the shift that's really going to make the impact has got to be a global community one, and I think that one will take longer.
Yeah.
So I agree with you, but
But it starts on an individual
Yes,
basis.
yeah,
We all
I agree.
have to take action.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, my father was a huge believer in me. So even though I screwed up, my academics over and over again, and my dad would just say, "Don't worry, son. You're brilliant. It's fine. You're just in second gear. As soon as you start to move it into third or fourth gear, it's going to move." And it seemed, my father's belief in me, and my mother's as well. My father really had this instilled in him as a small boy that one day you're going to go to England and you're going to be a famous doctor. And from the earliest age, in fact, his father used to teach him a rhyme that he then taught to us, which went like this: I am a human dynamo, bubbling over with energy. I will be who I can be. My possibilities are infinite. And then he used to, and I know I think his father wrote it, I think, and he taught him. Then he basically taught this stuff. But this idea of having someone who believes in you, doesn't have to be your dad necessarily, but someone who believes in you, is so important. It's the difference. I mean, Cage, did you have anything like this in your life?
Definitely. I've been blessed because of my natural charisma to network with people like yourself, like Helen Barefoot. Shout out to Helen. She's opened so many doors for me at university level. But I feel like black men need those sponsors, as we were speaking about, sponsors who can knock on the door and say, okay, this person is brilliant. Give them that opportunity. Because I feel like we claim to say that our system is meritocratic, but it's not. In fact, it's those who know people who actually open those doors and get into those places. So black men need those places. Okay, he may not come from a specific background, he may not have those connections, but he's brilliant. Give him a chance. And a lot of us don't have that chance, so we just go the easy way. And unfortunately, the easy way is generally crime or something illegal. So that's what we're sort of fighting against. We need more sponsors in our community.
And so when you say sponsors, I guess that's another word for role models, right? And
yeah.
Rashida, you've been successful, but did you have a role model? Obviously, you had a huge amount that came to you from home.
Yes.
But in the workplace, did you have a role model? Could you look and say, that's someone who looks like me? I mean, how did it work for you?
For me, as you said, a lot of it came from home and from that, the confidence that I had instilled in me from how I was brought up. When I got into the workplace, well, it wasn't as diverse as I would have liked. But I was used to that, frankly.
Wasn't as diverse as you'd have liked. Is that code for like, you're the only black person in the firm? Or what's that?
That's code.
What did you say?
I wasn't the only black person, thankfully. There were
two of you.
No, there were two other females ahead of me who were at the firm who immediately I was able to identify with because one of them wanted to be a litigator, which is what I wanted, and so seeing her in that position within the firm, confident, fiercely intelligent black woman was great.
You see, this is so important. This idea of you see someone,
Yes,
it shows you the way. That this is,
of course,
it made me believe that this is possible, and this is how I can operate, and and in an authentic way.
Yeah.
The problem was that any further up than a junior associate, there wasn't anyone. In a position of leadership, absolutely not.
So that then becomes a self-limiting belief almost,
Of
which
course.
is that I may get that far, but I just don't see it any further up the
thing is,
chain.
from my perspective, and I think because of the background I had, I didn't see it as a barrier. I thought, well, the fact that there isn't someone there doesn't mean that I can't be. Absolutely, I can. But what it made it difficult for me to see was what it would look like for me in that position. I could see, we'll talk about the partners and senior management. I could see people operating in a way that worked for them that didn't work for me. I was this, a bit like you, I think, more charismatic and bubbly and really good at building relationships and rapport with clients, working well in teams, doing things in a slightly different way, wanting to focus on, really the things that I really loved about my job were business development as well as the actual technical application of the law. And it made me realize that actually I couldn't see many partners who would operate in a way that felt authentic to me.
Yeah.
And so I just found that there was a bit of a disconnect between who I really was and who I would have to be in order to take up a position like that.
Yeah.
Of course.
I couldn't see someone who was doing it in the way that I wanted to do it.
Yeah. Dave, does
Mm.
that chime with you? I mean, this idea of role models and the role that they play in a successful development of your career.
Definitely chimes with me. So part of my upbringing, I grew up in a church. I grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist church, and the church I went to in Willesden, I looked around and there were engineers and there were lawyers and there were doctors, and if you didn't go on to do a degree, it was like, well, what the hell are you doing? So that kind of aspiration was always there. But my dad also had a very incredible Pan-African library. So I grew up learning about Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara. Now, Thomas Sankara was a big role model for me in Burkina Faso, because he empowered women, he empowered the economy. He was like, I don't care about...
Didn't end well for him, right? In the end, it didn't end well for him.
It didn't end well for him, and that's why, unfortunately, when you tie economics and politics together, sometimes someone's going to bump you out, usually the Americans, but we'll come talk about that all the time. But the reality was that seeing those role models were brilliant, but then I also looked outside the community, and I looked at people like Richard Branson and Anita Roddick, who was running Body Shop, and I really liked that. And then even even more than that was the being able to read magazines like Black Enterprise and Ebony and seeing these people who had been able to build these amazing businesses. And for me, that role modeling always drove it. So I was able to look within the community and with outside and see what values people held. And once I could align myself with those values, then they became...
Values, this is so important.
Yeah.
This idea of values, right? It's just, this is stuff we get from home, if we're fortunate enough to have that kind of a setup. But
Yeah, of course.
how do we instill great values in our youth today? Because frankly, this is the problem we've got. This is the reason that we have what we have at the moment. The values are not there. How do we do that?
But how can we preach about values when it feels as though the people at the top are winning and they've been valueless and they've done anything to get to that position? So when I feel so disadvantaged already, I feel like I'm going to do anything to get to that money or to get that car or to get that watch. So the system doesn't seem to uphold values. So why should I then support that in any way? What's your response to that sort of mentality that could pervade in a young black boy?
I think you just got to live it. The best thing you can do is live it, because there's one of the things I love about working with young people is they can smell BS a mile away. They know when you're not telling the truth. They know when you're not being present. And whether you've worked in a school, a prison, a young offending institute, you've got to go there and be your authentic self. So being able to talk about those experiences and living, and for me, I share a lot of my vulnerabilities, because I think that's one of the things about a role model. You should be able to say, this is where I've done well, but this is where I've screwed up as well.
So what would that be?
Could
Share about what might be a vulnerability that you would, how might you do that?
So for example, I've told students when I lost a business and I had to sell my house because I made money, but then just after the 9/11, the whole industry, IT industry, just kind of like melted, and I lost my house, we lost my business, and my wife and I were expecting our second child, and my wife miscarried. And I share that with the young people to say, look, life isn't a bed of roses. There's going to be some bumps along the way, and how we manage is a lot of depend on our own resilience. It depends on the people who we're surrounded by, and often I'm sharing that story, and obviously you can hear a pin drop when I share that. But that vulnerability allows me then to build a bit of rapport, a bit of trust, and say, look, it's not straightforward. No, it's never going to be a bed of roses. But for me, it's if you're just looking at somebody and thinking, oh, everything's going to be fine, and I think you've sold young people short. If you can be able to say, look, I've made mistakes.
I think this is so important. Yeah. It's so important now, because that's the problem, is that if you are a young person, doesn't matter what color you are, but you look at people who are more successful, you somehow think that it fell to them in some spectacular way that was very fortunate for them, but your life is a million miles away from that, and it's very hard to identify. So only by being vulnerable and saying, look, I tell you what, I completely messed up my A levels, which by the way I did. And
I messed up one.
You messed up one, I messed up all of them. I had to do the whole lot, had to do the whole lot again. It's only when you do that, and then you show that it's by the application of grit and belief and hard work and perseverance and having a vision and a dream and a goal, and for me a faith. I had a very strong Christian faith, right, which kind of was indispensable for me. But all these things are incredibly important.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that when you teach a young person the values, you help them to understand, what is important in life, what they're able then, you're sort of equipping them to be able to deal with life's challenges without having to come back to you every time. You're giving them a life skill, how to handle disappointments, how to get up when you really don't feel like getting up and trying again. And so really instilling those, whether it's through religion. I mean, for me, I grew up, when in my household, we grew up in a Muslim household, and I did find actually that religion was very useful for me because of the values that it taught me and the way that it helped me overcome challenges.
Of course.
Now as a Christian, I get the same source of strength from that faith. But also I had to, after many years in the corporate world, and finding myself these very confusing thoughts about, okay, so who am I really? What do I really want?
Yeah, of course.
Sitting down and thinking about, okay, what are my values? Who is it, who am I? What does being true to myself actually mean? Really thinking about that and coming up with a clear plan to get me to a place where I really was being authentic is what I think made the difference. It meant that I was enjoying my work a lot more. It meant that I knew when it was the right time for me to leave as well and start, my new venture, because I'm not now worried about making other people happy or fitting into the community I find myself in.
Let me ask a quick question. That's very powerful. A quick question around this business of being at the table. Because very often I'll have a conversation, usually with someone who's young, maybe black, but not necessarily, and they will make this point that I've always had this dream to get into the city. I didn't know anyone in the city. There was no one there who looked like me, but I finally made it and I'm in, but now I can't find my place. I'm struggling to find my place. I'll often find myself in a room, they'll say, and I don't know how to get into the conversation. I don't know how to be at the table. Conversation seems to go around, and then the meeting's over. And although I had something to say, I never found my way to get in there. Is that something, Rashida, can you just give us some pointers around how you dealt with that and how did you manage to get into the conversation? How were you able to be at the table?
It wasn't easy, I have to say. I think for the first 2, maybe 3 years, I just had my head down. You know, I was grateful for the job, and I just thought, you know what, I'm just going to work my socks off. I want to be the best lawyer I can be. I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to stand out in the wrong way. I already stand out. If I make a mistake, then it's going to be very hard for me to live down. That was my attitude, and so I put my head down and I worked, and then it got to a point where, I mean, there is a steep learning curve, but I got to a point where I felt a bit more comfortable. I knew what I was doing, and I knew that I wasn't happy, actually, because I wasn't able to have that seat at the
When your
table.
best self.
Yeah, I wasn't. You know, I was sitting down, I was having thoughts, I was thinking, oh, we should probably do this, but I didn't say anything. I was in the back, I was in the corner, I was at the end of the table taking notes, and I just wasn't happy with that anymore. And so it was actually a matter of talking to myself quite sternly and saying, look, you're not going to be happy if you continue like this. You need to start trying. And it was things like forcing myself to speak at every meeting and just saying, look, you have to speak once. Even if you think you have nothing to say,
so
you've
important.
just got to contribute.
Just be there.
At every single meeting. And then it just became easier. And then I started to realize, oh, actually, you know, my perspective and my points of view are valued. Not always. Not always, but I could get over
But at least
that.
you got your point across. And
Yeah.
Dave, is that something that you've got any
So
perspective on?
I'm a firm believer that for individuals who are in those spaces is to think like a leader. At the core of all the work that I do is that leadership piece, and it's really good to be able to know and develop your domain expertise, whether that's finance, legal, marketing, all the rest of it. But the leadership piece is how do we communicate with other people? How do we build trust? How do we take people on a journey? And so part of it is things like, if I know that somebody knows somebody else in a meeting, I say, try and get them to amplify your point of view so they can, when you're saying something, they can amplify so people can hear where
What
it's
a great
coming
point.
from you.
Did you do that before the meeting? Or
Way before the meeting. I've done it primarily when I've coached women who are going into positions of leadership, and I say, get people to amplify. So when your point is made, some guy or some other person doesn't take that away, your point is amplified. I said, but you can't make a difference unless you're there. And sometimes it does mean that you have to avoid the table. I'm going to say this really quickly. So I was invited to Downing Street for the Black History Month event in October, and I declined. And the reason why I declined was because I just didn't feel that I was honouring my parents for the treatment of the Windrush generation by going to Downing Street and just drinking wine and nibbling or what have you. And I got challenged by a number of black peers who said, how can you make a difference if you're not at the table? And I said, that's not an event where you're actually at the table. This is something where you're just celebrating. When you are in the actual room making a difference, you will know just turning up to Downing Street is not being at the table. So when you are in those positions, for me, it is about being able to go, I'm going to say this, I'm going to hold my boundaries, but I'm going to say it, whether you like it or not, I'm actually going to say it, and I'm going to make sure it's a point that actually adds value, and find people around you who will help to amplify or develop that.
This is so powerful. Cage, you finding this useful?
Yeah, incredibly useful. I'm just taking notes in my head because, again, I spoke about how anxious I feel going into corporate environments. So David saying that you should still find somebody to amplify your opinions is great. But I just hope that there is somebody who buys into my talent when I do go into these corporate environments who can sort of echo and be a soundboard for me. So
it's going to seep out your system.
We're going to seep out my system.
We're going to make it work, like it seeps out your system.
Definitely.
But it's also about knowing what you want, right?
Yeah.
You know, what you want for your career, what you want to achieve, and just focusing on that, and not thinking that you need to have necessarily anybody supporting you or that will come, but you have to have that self-belief in order for it to happen.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And for me, it's also about having a responsibility towards my community, that when I do get into these environments, I'm mentoring actively, like I mentor people now. And I'm like, again, I'm very young myself, so just trying to push people and get through this pipeline, saying, okay, I've been here, now I want to push you to be as brilliant as me. So it's very incumbent for all of our young black people to be mentors and leaders within our small spaces already.
I'm going to say one last thing if I can. One of the things I learned, I met this guy on Sunday, and it was really important. I've always seen it that if I've been able to go into these spaces, that I've always used the phrase standing on the shoulders of giants, and I want people to come and stand on my shoulders. And somebody threw a point to me on the week, and I thought it was really powerful. So instead of telling younger people or people who are behind you that you're standing on your shoulders, make sure that they know we're walking in shoulder to shoulder. And that has a different impact altogether, because then you see me as your peer, and you see me as an individual who has your best interests at heart, but I'm not trying to be that person that, I'm that person outside of your reach. I'm saying, I know your journey may not be the same, but I'm walking with you shoulder to shoulder to make sure that happens.
Yeah,
and for me, that's actually mind-blowing. I'm glad it's on tape.
Guys, you've been amazing. Thank you very much indeed. Cage Boons, Rashida Abdulai, Dave McQueen. Can't thank you enough for coming and joining me on Talk About Black. This has been Talk About Black, where we talk about what it means to be black in 2018 and in the years ahead. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again. Thank you.